All right, let's go ahead and get started. We're gonna so right after this we have lunch, so just bear with us. Just one more session. So this one's on work-life balance. So again, my name is Shwetak Patel. So if you're in the other session, I'm a professor at University of Washington. So this is Beth Minette from Georgia Tech. So we're going to be talking about work-life balance. So the way we're going to do this is we'll have a few remarks, just some things that we've experienced in terms of work-life balance and kind of tips, techniques, strategies, what our thoughts are around it, and then open it up for questions and whatever's on top of your mind. So the other way to look at this is how do you do it all without working 24/7? I showed this slide deck to some of my students when I was working on this. They started laughing. They're like, "You do work 24/7?" I actually don't work 24/7, so there's a bit of a misconception. But I'll talk about kind of how we juggle things. It's an interesting session because Beth and I are probably the worst examples for work-life balance, and because we do take on a lot of things, but we still do a good job of, I think, work-life balance. So we'll show you that we're still sane. So a little bit about myself. So I got my PhD at Georgia Tech in 2008. So I've been at UW for 10 years. So it's been a decade to this date, to this month that I've been at UW. I've taken a lot of stuff. I'm associate director for the School of Computer Science for Research and Innovation. So one notch below the chair, which I don't think I'll do the chair thing anytime soon, but at least I kind of dabble in it a little bit. I direct this new program called the Global Innovation Exchange, which is this partnership with Tsinghua University. So a couple of director positions, a lot of grad students, 12 PhD students, and a member of the CCC, and then a number of industry engagements. So the other thing I kind of do right now is I actually split my time between UW and Google. So faculty hat on and a Google hat on. So got a lot of stuff going on right now. They're all exciting and fun things, but it could take a toll on work. But at the same time, 2 kids, married also to a professor at UW, 5-year-old and 3-year-old, a dog and 2 cats. I actually come from a huge family. So I was born in the U.S. My parents immigrated to the U.S. a little over 30 years ago before I was born. I have 50 cousins. My dad is one of 9, my mom is one of 5, and when you do the math across all the cousins, that's 50 cousins in the U.S. So I got a lot of couches I can sleep on, and family is really important to me, and so that's a thing that both our immediate family and our extended family, and so that's really important. I'm into a lot of tinkering, so I've got my own a maker shop at home where I like to build stuff. My kids are getting into building things. That car on the bottom left is Rohan, my 3-year-old, and you can see him being pulled back because that is a souped-up car. That is a car that can go 13 miles per hour, which is way faster than it was designed to go. You can see him pulling back, so I like to tinker. I get my kids involved. We're in the Pacific Northwest. So we love skiing, snowboarding, hiking, ton of hiking pictures. The kids are getting into it. Maya, our 5-year-old, just did our longest hike, which was 4.2 miles, 1,000-foot elevation, which is awesome, not even on a backpack. The tip was every 10 minutes she got a gummy bear. Whatever it took, she did the 4-mile hike.
Just like planting them on the ground.
Basically, yeah. And at one point she forgot about them. We went 20 minutes without a gummy bear. But family is really important to me. So why are we talking about work-life balance? So academic life can eat you up. There's just so many things that you should be doing. I mean, Greg talked about this being the best job in the world. It totally is. I mean, you can have your cake and eat it too. Like I just mentioned, I have a great research program. I have great grad students. I have a great playground to do research. I'm in industry, so I can apply that stuff. Like, where else can you do this? Where else can you have your cake and eat it too? But at the same time, it can really eat you up because there's so many things to do. I mean, there's so many papers to read, all these conferences, all the service work you get, and all that adds up, right? And you can burn out, and people do burn out. And I think one of the things that's been really important for me is to acknowledge this, that what's the alternative? You can do all this work and burn out, which is not a good thing, or you can recognize that this is something that can happen and not feel guilty about saying no or taking breaks, right? And that's the mental shift I really had to have a few years into being a professor, was that, look, there's just some things I gotta say no to, or there's just some things that I'm not gonna feel guilty taking a month off and not being on campus, right? Because the alternative is burning out, and that's not gonna happen. And so I think that's one thing you have to have this mental mindset shift, is that gotta take a break without guilt. Oops, wrong direction. So I won't bore you with time management because there's a lot of time management strategies. In fact, a lot of people have different strategies around that. But just one thing that I've adopted to address the endless list of tasks is that the 4 Ds. And some of you have probably heard this in other talks, but it's really around like addressing a thing that you get in front of you as quickly as possible. So one is delete. Do you even need to do it? Like, there's a lot of things you can just delete. There's just like, I mean, if it's not important to you, if it doesn't make any sense, if you're not the right person, just go ahead and delete it. Don't ponder it more than for more than a few seconds. Just delete it. Are there things that you can defer? So often you think about deadlines. Like I'm recently getting a bunch of promotion P&T letter requests, and there's just only so many you can do. I can't do a lot of those. But at the same time, there's also wiggle room in there. And I can't quite get it done next week. Can I get a few more weeks because I got a lot of travel going on? So recognize that you can get extensions, right? Because if it just doesn't fit in, just ask for that, right? You can defer some things. You don't want to defer too much because that backlog just gets bigger. The other one is delegate. So I'm getting much better at this, right? Delegating to students, senior students, staff that you might have. Empower them to be able to do a lot of that stuff. And so delegate, and that's a hard thing for a lot of people where if you're a perfectionist, it's hard to delegate. But that's a really critical thing that I've realized that you have to be able to do. And the fourth one is a really important one, is diminish. Can you still address this thing that you need to do with less perfection? Right? So, all right, I can put 30 minutes into it. It will not be my best document I've ever created, but at least it gets it to somewhere where somebody else can take it forward. Or at least it gets it to a point where it's important enough that it's not perfect, but at least it moves the needle in some way. Or if it's something where you have to do your best work and you can't accomplish it, you've got to make that judgment call. So can you do the thing in a diminished capacity in that you can't put as much time into it, that much mental energy into it? Is that something you still want to do? Right? So this is kind of how I look at various tasks that come on the plate. There's this thing that you often get told from your mentors is learning how to say no. Right, and so, and it's probably the first thing people tell you is say no. And I took that to heart where I started to say no to a lot of things, but I felt super guilty about that. But I didn't quite want to say no, but why did I say no? One thing to recognize is if you say no, the opportunity will still be there. There'll be other opportunities. It's not like you will recognize the one-in-a-lifetime opportunities and you will say yes to that. But a lot of these things, you'll have other opportunities in the future. But one of the things I've been starting to do recently, the last few years, I've flipped that a little bit, and I've basically been thinking about what are the things I will always say yes to. I mean, it's a kind of an interesting exercise, right? That's a pretty bold statement. I'm going to say yes to everything, and what is that one thing? And the reason why it's an interesting exercise is that it helps prioritize what are the things that are really important to you, what are the most rewarding things for you, and it can kind of help prioritize kind of what your career goals are, right? So for me, student engagement is always really important. So if a student in my department or at a university ever emails me for a meeting, I will never say no. I've never said no to a student meeting. And the way I've been able to compensate for that is I have office hours where it might be a few weeks or months before you talk to me, but I will talk to you, right? So I've set up my schedule in a way that there is open office hours. There could be a long line. That's okay. I will get to every student. But it might take a while to get on my calendar, but I never say no. Like if somebody has career advice that they need, they're looking for a job, they need some advice on something that they're doing, I actually have never said no to a student at our university. Right? That's something I will never say. That's something that I will say yes to, because that is the most rewarding thing is enabling somebody else's career. And so there's a couple of these things that I will never say no to. I will always say yes to. And so this might be an interesting exercise for you. What are those things, right? Very rarely do I say no to a CCC event or a CCC thing, but I don't always say yes to it because there's usually travel involved, and that's almost impossible. But I have found some things that I will always say yes to because that's what I want to do, and that's the most rewarding thing for me. The other one is setting consistent boundaries. So I have very strict family time. My students know that they're not going to get an email between 6 to 8 p.m. on a weekday. They'll get an email maybe at 10 o'clock or 11 p.m., but they kind of know when the family time is. So when we pick the kids up from school, from that point onward until they go to bed, we can be on technology, but it's only on the technology for coordination. Like I don't actually, like it's family time. We cook together, we have family time together, my wife and I put the kids to bed together, and then we have our own time. And then if you have some energy left, then you can have work time, maybe 10 or 11 onward. So that's very precious time for us, and that we're very consistent about that. Weekends, I mean, it's pretty much family time the entire weekend. So, but what I've recognized for my style of work is I have soft boundaries. So on the weekend, if there's an emergency, I will take a phone call. Like I will, and my wife and I have recognized that there are some things that we need soft boundaries for. If there is a fire to put out, I will take that phone call. I'll take that phone call even during family time, but acknowledging with our family that I'm going to do this for a few minutes and I'll come back, right? But family time is very precious. We also have our daily debrief meetings, which is typically in the car where we transition from school back to home, which is actually just a great time to catch up. And that's actually a very precious time for us as well, that we always do that. The other thing that my wife and I recognized very early was unintentionally making work for the others, right? Because she's right there, it's easy for me to say, can you look at this paper for me really quick? Or I'm about to submit this grant. Can you take a look at this paragraph? We don't do that. Because the fact that even though we're not intentionally creating work for our spouse or our significant other, it's really easy to do that, right? Because it's convenient, right? So we don't do that. That's like, it's either a collaborator or we send it off to a student, but we very, very rarely hand over something and just say, can you look at this really quick? I mean, if either one of us are in a ridiculous bind, maybe, but we've made a conscious decision that we don't do that because it easily can eat up into just the time, but also adding to the workload. And it's just so easy to do that, and it's something you have to be conscious about. Juggling it all. And this is, and I'm guilty of this as well. Like I context switch nonstop in a week. And this is something you have to really think about what works for you. For me, context switching within a day is more effective than between days. So instead of saying like Monday's my Google day, Tuesday's my UW day, CCC's my Wednesday day, that doesn't work for me. I actually thrive off of constantly context switching, which is bizarre, but that's how I operate. So my meetings are intermixed. I'll have a student one-on-one meeting, I'll have a Google meeting. I might have a service meeting, and then I might go teach, and I come back, right? So context switching is what I thrive off of, and that keeps me on my toes. But it doesn't work for everybody. But I think that's one of the things to recognize is how do you context switch, and based on your ability to context switch, that's when you can try to figure out how can you compartmentalize the work that you're doing. And really for me, juggling it is if it's rewarding or not, right? So is this thing I'm doing personally rewarding? And secondly, am I saying yes to something where one of the first things I ask is if it's rewarding or not, but the other thing I ask is, do I want to be around the people that are in that thing that I'm going to say yes to, right? Because the people matter. So am I going to have fun doing this thing? And so that's the other thing to recognize is the people around you, whatever you're doing, is that something that is going to be exciting? And then you have to really figure out kind of what I mentioned about diminish. You got to make compromises, right? One of the biggest compromises I've made in the last 5 years is that I've only taught 3 classes at UW, right? And that's something that was a hard thing to do where I like interacting with students, so I do it on the research side, but haven't taught in a while. And that was a hard hit, right? I love teaching, I like building curricula, but that was a compromise I had to make to enable some of the other things. It's really hard to do, but that's something you have to basically make that compromise and live with it, or it's going to be really difficult. So that's those are my 2 cents, and I'll let Beth kind of continue the conversation a little bit.
Cool. Thanks, Trey. All right, and for those of you who do qualitative research can assess how much Shweta and I prepared this independently and end up saying the same themes as we go along with this. But I think I'll have a different take on some of the same issues. So I'm Beth Monin. I'm a professor at Georgia Tech, which makes me the old version of what Shweta just talked about because he graduated from our program. And I also got my PhD at Georgia Tech. I worked at Xerox PARC for a few years. And I think the main thing that's important on this slide is I've taken various administrator roles during my time. So both steering educational curriculum, our master's program in HCI, and then our Human-Centered Computing PhD program, and then taking on research administration roles, both with the GVU Center and the new Institute for People and Technology. I'm also the past chair of CCC, so I'm very excited that you're here and just very excited about this symposium. So when I talk about work-life balance, these are some of the things that I've been balancing on the work side. My research is in human-centered computing, in assistive technology, personal health informatics, ubiquitous computing, and so on. And those are lots of fun pictures and emphasis on the student pictures, and I'll come back to some of those. But Andrew likes the cameo there. Okay. And this is really just an excuse to put cute pictures of my kids up there. But like Shweta, I'm also married to a professor, so we don't really mean that to be advised. Don't ditch your current spouse and go marry a professor. It has advantages and disadvantages, and it's interesting, the rule you have with Julie and how Blair and I have tried to balance the same kind of things. There are advantages because people understand the type of life you're living. There are disadvantages because then you have two people perhaps who are trying to work 24/7. So that's some excitement. My children are older. I meant to have them here as props, but Delta did not cooperate, so they're at home behaving while I'm on this trip. My daughter is 16, my son is 13. And we travel around, and one of the advantages of our life and our work style is I've been able to take them on a variety of trips and conferences with me. So Grace was at Snowbird with me. I couldn't find the picture of the two of them under the Kai 2014 banner, but they've attended that. They've sat in the back of various panel sessions and ignored everything I've said. So that's one advantage, and that's us when we were, I think that was UbiComp when we were in Beijing. We have the variety of critters, and this is again just to entertain you, but 2 rescue dogs, a guinea pig, and a bearded dragon, and the bearded dragon seems to like no one in the family, but we're working on that. And I've lived in Atlanta for 20 years. Schwedek has a huge family tree. I have a narrow branch. I'm an only child of an only child. And for those of you who are grappling or at some point will grapple with the work-life balance also meaning about taking care of parents, that's also an issue, not omnipresent in my life, but you can definitely see it coming. I'm not the outdoorsy type, but I love to cook. So those are a picture of Gruyere French cheese rolls, and that's an excitement because my daughter and son are both slowly taking some of that on. So that's the batch she made for me for my recent birthday. So nice. Very, very cool. So we're going to talk about time management, and I think the main thing I want to emphasize off of what Schwedek said, because we all know that time management is incredibly important for work-life balance, is experiment with the strategy till you find one that works for you. There is no one right strategy. And the way I tend to think of this is, A, I get things done and things don't fall through the cracks, but more is that I come up with a strategy where I don't stress myself out. And if I can feel myself getting stressed, it's like, okay, come back, reflect on what I'm doing. I have the world's simplest to-do list, just a plain text list, and I move things around and I bold them and I tab them over based on what things are, but it's the world's simplest strategy, but it allows me to just kind of keep a handle on what I'm doing. I write Anne used to get these, she'll laugh. I write a weekly email Sunday night or Monday morning that tells my extended collaboration network what I'm up to. And so if they know if they know that I'm going to be at the weekly group meeting, then they're probably not going to bug me because they're going to see me in 2 days later. And so that helps people kind of calibrate their demands on me, at least a little bit, and lets them know what I'm around. And it's mostly that I'm figuring out how I can do what when. I've gotten really good at I really don't want to work on this, but I'm going to do this for, that beautiful open hour I have in the morning, and then save some of those other simpler, more fun tasks for the late afternoon when my brain is only capable of doing those kinds of things. So the main point is there is no one method. You have to figure out the method that works for you. The other thing that I remind people, and as academics, we're way obsessed about money because we have to raise money to fund our research programs. And I know I can't really print money, but you can create money. You can create opportunities. You can pay for things, whether that is the maid service that comes every week to my house, or whether it is how I balance kind of who does what on my research programs. But you can't print time, right? It is a finite resource, and I feel like sometimes we spend way too much time worrying about the dollars and cents, and we don't really manage this precious resource that we have, which is really the most valuable thing that you have. All right, priorities. We both mentioned the juggling. When I was a rising senior in college, I was part of this great program, and I heard this great speaker who talked about juggling and said, we drew pictures of the things that we juggle. And then she said, you have to realize that some of those are rubber balls and some of those are glass balls. And when you're juggling, you have to realize the impact of what happens when you drop one of those. And you need to pay attention to the ones that are glass balls. So what are glass balls? Glass balls are your family. They're your health. They're the things that keep you sane. They're the things that you rely on. They're the things that give you strength, understanding where your own strength comes from. And you're going to have to prioritize those over all the other balls that are painful and embarrassing perhaps when you drop them, but they do bounce one way or the other. So really keeping in tune as to what that means. And also for me, and I think Schwedek said this another way, understanding what your core values are about why you do what you do. So I come from a family, I don't know how many women here, who I'm like the first time with, career professional woman, right? As opposed to being the stay-at-home mom. And so there's a lot of implicit values in my family of why are you doing that work thing? And some people laugh, they're like, has your mom met you, Beth? But there's always this kind of internal question in my brain, like, why am I spending my time doing this as opposed to following more traditional paths? And the thing that I have found that keeps me sane in that space is to understand what I really value about what I'm doing, which is the students, it is the people, it is the interactions, it is the potential impact of the work. Maybe less so the next Chi paper, but more seeing the results of that work out there. That keeps me going, and it helps me work with that inner monologue of why I do what I do. Impression management is an interesting question for us, and because it's not only your work-life balance, what's going on in your head, but how do you present that to the rest of the world? And of course, now we have this thing called Facebook, which is this whole impression management machine, and we can talk about whether I should stop using Facebook at the end of the break, but right now I still do, a lot less than I used to. But I've actually found it to be a valuable resource in conveying my work balance, life balance to others without giving a talk like this. So for example, I found out amongst the students who were interacting with me that they thought I worked 24/7, and I don't. I love sleeping. I get my 7 to 8 hours a night, and I spend a lot of quality time with my family. But they only saw that professional part. And what I discovered was they were doing that mental calculation of, okay, well, Beth's doing awesome stuff, but I don't want to try to live the life she lives, because they had an inaccurate impression of what that life was, because they couldn't see inside the other parts. So I spent a lot of time actually consciously thinking about how I convey my work-life balance to other people. Partly because as a role model, right, teaching that to students, teaching that to others around me. I'm also now a boss, and that includes having a lot of staff that are not in this for the PhD crazy, but they're in this because this is just their day job and what they do working at Georgia Tech. And so respecting their family and their work-life balance and their values is very important. And I will confess the hardest one is conveying that as an employee. I am in some rooms where I am the youngest one by a decade, and I'm the only woman, and conveying that, no, I really have to go home because my daughter has X on her schedule is sometimes difficult when I'm in a room with a lot of people who don't really share that same lifestyle. But it's also an important thing for me to do because it's important for all the people that are going to come after me in those roles. So this is one thing I wanted to flag, is not only is you balancing this yourself, understanding how you're implicitly training everyone else around you and informing their impressions of you is critically important. And then finally, for me, it comes down to being, it's all about people. So when I'm staring at that really simple text to-do list, I'm almost always, I find myself making decisions about how this impacts others, which means I'm really bad at travel expense statements, right, Anne? And really bad about reports. I'm really bad. But if it's a letter for someone, or if it's meeting for someone, or if it's career advice, or it's the part of their research they need to propel forward, those are the tasks that I find myself gravitating to. So I have realized that it's part of my core values, and people as my children, my husband, my students, my colleagues around me, that's what drives me. So with that, we've said some similar things and some different things, but we would love to open this up for discussion. And the people in the room that know me too well, kind of wait before you out me on the things I've mentioned.
So Lorenzo De Carli, Worcester Polytechnic Institute. First of all, thank you for, this sounds like really useful advice. One question and observation I have is that I found that many, if not most people, desire to achieve a work-life balance and understand it's a good thing to have, but sometimes are unable to do so because of institutional pressure and peer pressure, right? Mm-hmm. I've been lucky in my academic career, but I've heard horror stories of people being encouraged not to have children during tenure track, sure, or not having more than one child, or being expected to make themselves available in such a way that makes it impossible to save time for family life and other things. So And when you're an assistant professor, it's really unclear what, is this going to affect my tenure? If I say no to this, is this going to damage my career? So I would be interested in hearing your advice about how to deal with this sort of external pressure of not to do the right thing, basically.
Yeah. I can talk a little bit about that. Yeah, that's a great question. Some departments and universities have really taken work-life balance to heart, and they're implementing things that are moving in the right direction, but not all. And even then, you have people that have just a very different reflection on work-life balance. Somebody may have gone through a different tenure process where, no, you are working 24/7, but has not realized the world has changed or is changing, and we need to change it. I think so. Some of the things that have been effective, or to think about, is find. This is something we talked about in other sessions. Is like-minded people that have gone through kind of what you've gone through, and being able to. There are always other role models or senior members of the faculty that appreciate and acknowledge work-life balance as much as you do. And I think having them as role models and helping you navigate that is one way of thinking about it. The other thing is I've always made it, in our department, we're really supportive of work-life balance, but there's other parts of our university that's very different, where they have a very traditional mindset where, why are you going to pick up the kids at 3 o'clock? Shouldn't somebody else be doing that? And I've always set a very hard boundary there, saying that, nope, I engage with my family in this way. This is where it is going to be, and if you want to be able to collaborate or work with our group, this is how we operate, right? So not all the time you can actually have that hard line, right? But sometimes you can have that. So I think setting that expectation so that people know what your availability and how you operate from early on, I think helps to set that stage. Where if you try to work 24/7 and then you try to shift that, I think that makes it complicated and much more difficult. But I think being consistent from the beginning is one thing. And the other one that like I said, is identifying people that are like me that have gone through this and using them as role models and having them as providing feedback from them, I think has been really helpful for kind of what we've done in the past.
Yeah, some tactics.
Yep.
Okay. Some tactics that we've used, again, kind of creating that solidarity of like-minded people. So you guys have all been in this, where there's a public email chain discussing maybe when to schedule the RP&T discussion meeting. And then there's that private email chain amongst us who are the suggestion that it be at Friday at 5 because that's the time when everybody has free. Is really not a good suggestion. So I've definitely been in lots of discussions where we rally ourselves and we just say, okay, I'm going to say something and then you're going to pile on and you're going to pile on. And we know that we essentially have company in that. And you do have to realize that some of the requests are not actually a disagreement with you. It's just maybe someone hasn't thought it through, or they just don't have that insight into everything else that's going on. So I've gotten requests Beth, can you do this? I agonize probably for too long, but I write back and say, no, sorry, I've got too much on my plate. And they're like, that's okay, we figured you were too busy, but we wanted to ask you anyway. Again, the great discussions about why we shouldn't have faculty meetings in the evenings because no one teaches then, is a reminder that, that 11 o'clock on Tuesdays and Thursdays are also reserved for that. And someone's just not thinking it through because they just don't deal with the same constraints. But once you push back a little gently, it's like, oh, okay. So I think the short version is finding other people who are like-minded and realizing that what may seem, because it was Tom who was talking about the tenure monster under the bed, right? What may seem like an agonizing decision for you may be just like an off-the-cuff request on the other end, and just kind of finding that consistency to push back generally will win the day. Lana.
Hi, Lana Hiroshi, University of Minnesota. Lots of great strategies. Thank you. I'll be using some of these, and lots of good metaphors as well. One of the things that I struggle with is when people talk about work-life balance, they don't necessarily want to put actual numbers on it. What is work-life balance? And the question that I found to be surprisingly controversial is it reasonable to try to work a 40-hour week? And I have received answers to that question from, are you kidding me? This is completely impossible, and you shouldn't even be trying to do this, to a secretive, I am also trying to do this, and you shouldn't let anybody know, though. Don't ever let anybody know that you're trying to do it. So what is the work-life balance in terms of number of hours and maybe not every week, but on average? And
Yep.
is it reasonable to aspire to a 40-hour work week?
So I've played around with some of these numbers because maybe I'm just too detail oriented, so I pay attention to these things. I will not say that I've gotten down to a 40-hour week, but what I do try to do is try to keep kind of the Georgia Tech CCC things that I'm paid to do, which is a rough category, into something that I consider appropriate. And so I realize that, what I will do is take time away during the day for some family activity and then swap that in the evening. Where I can't get to that number is actually some of those people things. If it's reviewing someone's proposal draft or writing letters, I tend to steal some time on weekend mornings when my older kids aren't paying attention to me anyway. And so we're all kind of in our own quiet time, and that's where I tend to get those things done. So I think it's not completely impossible, but you have to kind of figure out what counts and what doesn't count and how you want to manage that. But I do try to keep it under control.
Yeah, and I do something similar too. So my kids are young enough that they still nap, and so nap time is a way that my wife and I have decided that that's a time to get caught up on things really quickly if we need to over the weekend. Early morning or late night, I don't go to sleep until a little bit later just because I'm a little bit of a night owl. And so that's an advantage there. But yeah, it is trading off for one and the other. The other way I look at it is I definitely have never counted. I should actually at some point. But I go by more feel in terms of like how I feel for the week. Like if I'm under the weather or if it's not been a great week, then my productivity is going to be lower, and I acknowledge that I'm just not going to be very productive this week. There might be some weeks where I'm super productive, I'm on my game, and so it's basically I look at each week to make sure I keep my sanity, because I don't want to overload the week so that I get burned out for that week even. And so it's more around what is my mental capacity and my bandwidth and my ability to execute on these various things and make trade-offs that way, and I'll defer a lot of things if I can. But I do have the high priority things, which are graduate students and some of the other things where people rely on me, where it's their career. I make sure to prioritize that for the week. But it's definitely depends on the week. There's ebbs and flows where some weeks are just not productive at all, just because I'm just not in the right mental state, but other weeks that it might be more than a 40-hour week probably, but I don't really add them up. It's mainly just to make sure that each week I get to keep my sanity.
Yeah, and I think it's that same kind of consistency, right? You want to set the normal so that if you do have to have a crunch week, you got some room to give.
Exactly,
right?
That's right.
If you're crunching all the time, there's just no way.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
Hi, my name is Omar Chaudhry from University of Iowa. So how does planning turn out to be in practice realization? So are there tips and tricks? So every semester, beginning of the semester, I feel like, okay, I'm gonna do the right thing, take enough breaks so that I don't go crazy. But then in the middle of the semester, there is this death spiral that I turn into, like having 80-hour weeks and going crazy. And so are there tips and tricks to take this planning stage to the realization phase?
I mean, there's some things that we do as a family where it used to be the case we would plan out our work-related schedule and then figure out the family schedule, but now we do the opposite. We put all the family travel in first, and we work around that. And there's some things that are obviously impossible, where there might be a conference thing where we have to tweak things around. Where so in our quarter. We're on the quarter system, so the quarter planning basically has a lot of the family things that we put in there around the travel, the things that we're going to do for fun, the fun trips, and then we work on that, and those are not negotiable. Those are fixed in there, and that's helped me kind of manage things around it. But a lot of times I have to acknowledge that I just have to defer some of that stuff, right? When you get into this endless spiral, you have to take a step back and say, like, how do I get out of the spiral? And there's just some things I have to either delete or defer, and then that's the hard part. And I think being able to recognize that that's something you have to do is one of the things that I think over time you'll start to get more comfortable with. But what we've done is so that the spiral doesn't impact family gets scheduled first.
Yeah. I am crazy about my calendar. Email may be out of control and I kind of beat it down, but my calendar is kind of, again, that time is more precious than money perspective. And so again, putting things in the calendar, if I need to have regular meetings, boy, I better get them in there. I have to pay attention, like all of us, to how much travel I take on. And so I have a sense of, the trips that are per semester. And when I start to look at, nearing a number, I've got to say, no, I can't do this trip. We're going to have to defer. or decline it. So, when you're in that good spot at the beginning of the term, putting the pieces out there to give you that structure that you can rely on. And I've also had to learn that I have to start things a lot earlier than I used to. So used to, I could just do okay, this is due in a day, I'll sit and crank it out, and that just doesn't work anymore. And I actually do a lot better if I say, okay, I know I'm not gonna get this done, but I'm gonna get a good head start on it, and then it's just so much easier for me to be able to come back and finish it up. So that's learning to not be a graduate student mentality about just really pacing things.
Yeah. And the other thing that and everybody operates in a different way. Like I have colleagues that have amazing work-life balance, and they compartmentalize things. There's work, there's life, and there's my family. I have a much more softer boundaries. There's been times where I've literally lectured in class with an ergo baby with the little one on me, right? I mean, it's just like, you're gonna have to deal with it. If you want me to lecture, I'm gonna cancel class, right? And so I've made it a point that the little ones will be with me in a meeting. They just know to expect this. So it just depends on what style and what makes sense for you.
And I will flag for all the women in the room that sometimes that may be harder for women to pull off.
Yeah.
Yep. It's changing though, we're getting there.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Liron Shah from RPI. Recently I got a brilliant PhD student who told me that he doesn't want to become a professor because he doesn't want to reply emails at 11 p.m. every day. So it looks like I give him a kind of bad example of being an assistant professor. So
yeah.
I guess, I really like Elizabeth's presentation about giving people an impression about your lifestyle. So I guess my question is that how can I give him the correct impression of work-life balance? Thank you.
Yeah, I know email programs used to have this feature where you could write the email but then save for it to send later. And I miss that feature because there's a whole pile of emails that I would love to get delivered at 8 a.m. even if I'm writing them at 11 p.m. This is difficult with students. It's really difficult with staff. I have staff members that think that I want them to reply to me at 10 o'clock at night. I don't. I just need to get it off my stack. But if my email program crashes, I lose it all. So it's a real challenge. So I think that's why I've had the sending email out to my group, and that includes, Anne was laughing at me because I put that I was going to go do a Neil Diamond concert on my calendar for her to see. But it was a cool thing that we were doing. So I try to actually create more visibility into the other stuff. And have a discussion, sorry I lost you, have a discussion about your strategies with your students so that they see what you're trying to balance, because they're at a different point in their life, so they have to balance different things. But nevertheless, they still have work-life balance issues themselves. And as much as you can expose that as part of your mentoring and advising, then they can get a more realistic picture of what being a professor is like and how you make that work. As I said, when I discovered that the students had a really out-of-whack picture of what they thought my life was, I became much more conscious about trying to share that.
Yeah, and I echo that too. So I'm pretty transparent about kind of how I do email, and I make it clear that to the staff or even to students that I don't expect an email response at 10 p.m. It's just that's how my schedule has been set up, but that's not what the expectation is. And a lot of times some of those I actually just have a built-in preface that says I don't expect a response now, that I just have to put in there so people realize that. But I do something similar to what Beth does. Is I send a this week in the UbiComp Lab email to my students so they know exactly what I'm doing, but I also put all the fun stuff in there. And when I bump into them, they usually talk about the fun stuff. It's like, oh, okay, what hike did you do? Or how did you get to do 4 miles? Those kinds of things I put in there on purpose so they see that, yeah, it's like, so they don't just see one side of it, right? So.
Hello.
Hey.
Hi, Andrea Parker, Northeastern. So I really like the 4 Ds, and I'm trying to do them. So the delegate, I wondered if you guys could give examples of things that you delegate, because I think that I feel bad putting more stuff on my students, but I want to do that.
The recipients of the D for a lot of that is, when I agree to a director role, I always agree to saying that I'm going to hire an associate director who I can empower and get them to basically play the role that I'm playing, because that's what you're ultimately doing, is cultivating the next generation leaders. But for students, initially I always felt bad. But when I talk to the students, and when you actually when you reflect on this, this is a way for them to learn kind of what to do next, right? And they actually are open to it. So in my group, I have roles for everybody. You're the PR person, so we get a lot of PR inquiries. You are the person that does that. You're the person that handles the tours and interacting. For them, it's great because you have, like, Bill Gates will show up, and they're the ones doing the tour for Bill, right? So it's like they like these kinds of things, and some of those things are going to be fun tours, but eventually you'll get a really great one. If I'm delegating, even like doing the annual report for the NSF, right? Can you help me with this section? They're learning. Oh, they're like, yeah, I didn't know these are the things that you have to do, but this is great because now I can kind of anticipate what's going on. So I think you don't want to overload them, but spreading it around the students, I think, is one good thing, and then you can kind of move. You don't have to put everything on the same student, but you can actually spread it around. And I think delegating was one of the hardest things, but then I realized that they find it rewarding. Use it as a teaching opportunity.
Yeah, so same thing, and Andrew may laugh, but I have former students in the room. That makes this conversation interesting. Everything is a training opportunity, right? Take a first pass at a syllabus, take a first pass at a report. All of those things are things that graduates of my lab are going to do later in their career, and it's actually to their benefit if I create the space to make that happen. So that means I can't wait till the very last minute to do the report, because I have to be able to give enough time then to give the feedback and then lead through example about how I adjusted things and what that means. So you have to plan ahead to delegate in some instances, but I worry more about the students that don't get exposed to this is how you write a proposal, this is how you write a letter, this is how you do this, because then they're not given those tools as they then go and try to start their own laboratory and research group.
Hi, Andrea Barber, IBM Watson Health. So I'm in industry, so things are a little different. I have folks that I'm kind of managing their work, but they're not my student and I'm not their manager. I have colleagues that I work with. I also work with folks who have not gone through PhD programs or seen sort of like the time cycles that we work through in academia, or I also used to practice law, so I'm not used to putting those crazy hours. So what I always get into is a situation where other people are very comfortable protecting their hours, and then we have stuff that has to get done. So someone has to get it done by a certain amount of time. So I'm wondering if you've ever been in a situation where, because someone else is protecting their time, how do you then sort of protect your time at the same time, but get things done? You can't necessarily say I'm your boss, so you got to do it this way.
Yeah, so I think about establishing the values of the group is really important. So in the institute that I run, for example, we'll have the major Industry Innovation Day, which is, it's a major event. And the important thing is to describe the value of all hands on deck. And it's like, I respect your work-life balance, but this is a crunch week. And again, every week can't be a crunch week. But then it's like, okay, yeah, we're going to have to be here earlier or later, but everyone is going to work at home on Friday to make up for it. So, establishing the values, and I think it actually is really important that that everybody chips in. All right, and I think that is because then you start, well, this person has this issue and this person has that issue, and then I end up doing it all myself because it's not getting done, and then I just can't win.
Yeah, and so an example of this in the academic world could be, we have an Office of Sponsored Research where our grants, the button gets pressed for that NSF grant to actually be, the proposal to actually be submitted. Often, a lot of the folks that are in those teams, they consider it as really a 9-to-5 job. After 5 o'clock, we're not pressing that button from home. Whereas we're working on the grant all the way through the deadline. And so there it's a really tricky one, those proposals. And so one of the things that we've done there is that, it's not always going to be a fire drill, to acknowledge that we're not going to have a fire drill all the time, that we have these times of years where we've worked with the Office of Sponsored Research to basically say, look, everybody needs to chip in because this is an important thing for the university and everybody benefits. And so I think having that shared perspective and goal that there is mutual benefit there, because that is what holds the university together for these proposals that are going through, but also at the same time recognize that we can't have a fire drill every time, right? And so I think that's one thing that helps. Especially with my Google hat on, I run into this all the time, where lawyers have different schedules, where PMs have a different schedule, and the engineers have a whole different schedule, right? But I think it's creating the fact that creating this mindset where everybody's in it together, but it's not going to happen all the time, right? It's saying that these are fire drills that are one-offs that might only happen a few times a year, but not every week, right? I think that's something that is really important there. Yeah.
All right, and I'm going to stall because it's Andrew with the mic. So one strategy that I wanted to reinforce was just don't underestimate how much conveying what you're trying to do matters. So I recognize this with my kids who, again, they're teenagers and in their own screens and doing their own thing. And so in my mind, I'm hanging out on the couch, maybe answering email, maybe, putting something in my Amazon cart. But they may think I'm not interruptible, or they may think that I'm working. And so trying to be really clear, it's like, oh, I'm just hanging out. And actually, if I'm really stressed and working on a deadline, I will disappear upstairs, and they know if mom's at her desk, that means something else. Mm-hmm. But I didn't realize that they thought just because the laptop was open that they shouldn't be bugging me. Yeah. So again, trying to figure out how to make those signals. Other thing about teenagers is that you can try to make yourself available all evening long, and then they will still wait till around midnight to have that crisis moment where they really need to talk to you. All right, I haven't stalled enough. Andrew?
So, sorry, Andrew Miller, IUPO. I've been invoked a few times. I actually agree with the perspective that you've been sharing. So it reflected back. We used to check Facebook to see whether you were in the state or not. So the travel was super helpful. One of the things that you both mentioned that I found really helpful was this sort of making events work twice for you, or in your words, like the triple word score. Yep. So like our lab meetings were most weeks also our one-on-ones, just modeled in front of everyone, for example, and that actually made it really great because you could see that everyone's having the same problem and we can just address it at once, or like you can sort of reallocate resources. Are there other kinds of ways that you've been able to sort of double the efficiency, or think examples like that people might find useful?
Yeah, so for summers are really tricky for me because I have a lot more travel going on, a lot more family travel. So I don't have one-on-ones with students that are still around. A lot of them are on internship. So we'll kind of consolidate things where we'll have, not just undergrad office hours, but grad student office hours where there's a little bit more flex. The flex is on the students where they might have a lot more flexibility, but I might not have it. But I know that there's a smaller block that I can make sure make sure I'm available, so I don't have to be available for 2 days in a row for one-on-ones. So those are some things that we do, is to consolidate things that way. The other thing is I mean, and this is just me, I use transition times very effectively. So I'll have meetings that butt up against each other on purpose that are on separate sides of campus, so I get my run in. Like I would literally and so the other thing I do is I do a lot of walking meetings. And that keeps my sanity, gets me moving around because I'm a very fidgety person. The other thing is that transition. So if I'm driving from UW to Google, which is only a 5-minute, 10-minute drive, I can get a quick meeting in as well. So I also use the transition times to get meeting times for those are usually reserved for my students. If you have something that you really need me for, I'm not in the lab, I have those open times. So that's why I always my weekly emails, my weekly digest is, here are the gaps. If you need me, these are the perfect times to call me, right? So those are the things that I add efficiency in there. So the students still get FaceTime, or ability to get FaceTime with me, or at least get to talk to me if there's something coming up that's urgent.
Yeah, and so Andrew's laughing about my metaphor of double and triple word score about how I manage work. And so there's a lot of opportunities for that. So the default in my crew is that we have a weekly lab meeting, because I learned very early on that this is actually a delegate strategy, that students learn from each other and they will actually pick up and help each other out instead of me trying to individually manage all of that. And so I think that also is something that works well in the industry context. Because it, again, has kind of also a shared appreciation. There's a lot of things that you can do around paper writing and paper reviewing and proposal writing, where it's partly a delegation strategy because you're getting other eyes on the paper, and by getting your students to review each other's paper, but it's also a training moment because they're figuring out what they're learning from, so that's another double word score. A lot of things about websites, or the types of materials that you were talking about producing, so always produce something with an eye towards using it 3 different ways, and making sure you do that well. So again, just kind of a conscious effort of saying, okay, this is something that needs to be done. What are the ways that I can layer value on it by involving other people and maybe planning it slightly differently.
Tawanda Dillon Hunt, University of Michigan. Thank you again. This is great. Shweta, you said something that kind of, for me, I'm still thinking about it. You said that you pay attention to how you're feeling that week, right?
Yeah.
So that requires some, I guess, reflection.
Self-reflection, yeah.
Yeah. And can you talk about that a little bit more? I mean, I feel like maybe I do that too, but I'm not quite sure how I would explain that to the students.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, some of it's mental and kind of emotional, just because if it was like a roller coaster ride the last few weeks, am I in the right state to even be able to be able to produce whatever I need to produce at a high quality. Some of it's just physical, like, you know, we're under the weather, we're sick, and those kinds of things. But I try not to overdo it because I want to have enough of a gap left in that week so that if there's something does, like literally this week was a crazy week for me because, you know, I had this meeting, we had this CCC meeting, but literally the night before when I'm preparing some of these slides, I get a call from the Attorney General's office from Washington about this 3D printer gun thing. And like, I luckily I had enough mental and physical bandwidth left to work overnight on that thing before I got on the plane. So having enough of that, a little bit of a gap there, but it's usually, and it's never Sunday night or Monday. Like Monday, it's always just like kind of a slog, like getting into the Monday groove. It's usually midweek is when I actually get a good sense of that. So my meetings are actually biased in a way like that, where I actually have a slow ramp up time. Like I don't have Monday meeting. My Mondays are not jam packed of back-to-back one-on-ones because that's what I need that time to ramp up. So a lot of times I actually have 3 hours that are just blocked off that are just Shweta hacking time. Like I'm writing stuff, I'm building stuff, I need that time to myself. I might put some meetings in every now and then, but that's a way to actually see if what state am I in. And then the later parts of the week, like Wednesday, Thursdays, when I have the back-to-backs, right? And that, because by the time I get to that point, I can cancel some of them, I can make some of them more efficient, I can defer some of that. And so that's some of the things that it evolves over that week. Like there's not one day that I know how that week's gonna go. But yeah, so it usually takes a couple of days to figure out how that week's gonna go. Yeah.
I get a crazy amount of benefit of writing those Beth this week emails. I mean, even if no one else was reading them, I get the benefit of just kind of figuring out the pace of the week. And then I have the tiny little text calendar at the bottom that says, what's coming up and what's coming next. So that little bit of reflection that I tend to do somewhere between a Sunday morning to a Monday morning just helps me prep. Like, you're looking at the race and you're figuring out the terrain and this is what it's going to look like. And Mondays are my great writing and thinking times. And then I do a whole bunch of meetings in the middle. And then Friday, if I've still got it, is actually where I really focus on meeting with my students. It tends to be kind of the most creative and uplifting times.
Yeah, and that's something that I recognize too. Like the day of the week makes a big difference. Like I know what days I'm more creative than the others. It's just weird to think about it that way, but it totally does. Yeah, and then you want to start your weekend on a high note, which is usually engaging with students and talking about fun, cool things that they're working on and where they want to go with it. So I set up my schedule by design that way as well.
All right, and another thing important to you is food and nourishment.
Yeah, lunch.
So we should break for lunch.
Yeah.
All right.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.